Hi, I'm John DeDakis. I'm a novelist, a manuscript editor, a writing coach, and a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. You're one to one with me, and I'm one to one with William Cope Moyers. There he is in St. Paul, Minnesota. Uh, you and I worked together in the 1990s at CNN, and that was when you hit rock bottom and you started to deal with your alcoholism and cocaine addiction. So
Yes.
welcome to One to One. We're going to talk about your two memoirs and your book about what to do once you realize you need help.
Mhm.
So uh, you uh, you're just back from a book tour, right?
I'm in the middle of one actually, John. Thanks so much for having me on with your audience. Always, you've been such an important influence in my journey for a long time, as you noted. I just came back from Alaska, Portland, Oregon, and Southern California. I was gone for 8 days. That was sort of the official launch of the external part of the book tour. Although, as I've learned with podcasts and all the things that we do virtually now, you can always be in a book tour and you don't ever have to leave the house.
That's true. It's really true. And I would imagine you do a lot of podcast interviews as well.
Yes, I do. I'm new to this medium as it relates to promoting a book or talking about the issues that matter to me. I'm really fascinated by the depth and breadth and the reach of a podcast like this. I'm encouraged actually that we can reach a lot of people without having to go anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I started doing this podcast when COVID started,
Mhm.
and my commute was just down the stairs.
Well, and John, the other thing is that when we're talking about issues like we're going to talk about today, there's such a stigma around addiction, mental illness. There's a lot of shame, personal shame, and sort of public intolerance. So to be able to use this medium to touch people, I think is really effective because people then can be part of the conversation without showing their faces or showing up for some event. And while we like to do those kind of public events, this medium, I think, gives people an opportunity to connect without having to make the effort in a way that hopefully gets them or their loved ones the help they need.
And yet, I think that you're probably tremendously effective on the road, meeting with people. I mean, I've known you for a long time. You're very personable. And in fact, the irony is, and maybe, well, I don't know if it's an irony or not, but you and I were working together in October of 1994,
Mm.
and I had no clue how in trouble you were. And if I remember correctly, you told me when you returned to work that you were at such a low point that you were considering suicide by cop. Am I right about that? Am I
Yes,
remembering
John,
it?
I was. I never have struggled with mental illness the way so many people do. I've never been diagnosed with depression or bipolar disorder or any of those other debilitating illnesses. But I am a type A personality. I have a lot of anxiety. I'm a perfectionist, and I'm very fragile when I'm fragile. So when
Mm,
you and I were working together at CNN 30 years ago, right now, and I had a return to use. I'd been dry for 3 years in the early 90s. I'd had a return to use. I couldn't get out of it, and I was so ashamed
yeah.
of my quote failure that uh, I didn't have the guts. Candidly, I didn't have the guts to take my own life,
Mm, mm.
as some people choose to do. But I thought, maybe an overdose in the crack house, or maybe death by police officer resistance
Mm.
would solve my problem. I'm fortunate that my employer, my colleagues like you, my family, and others stood by me because here I am.
I can remember your dad called the CNN newsroom looking for you, and I picked up the phone and he said, "Is
Um,
Cope?" He said, "Is Cope there?" And I said, "No, he's not." And of course, he's a journalist. He was
yes,
doing the fact finding, uh, and of course now I'm a father who has lost a son to an addiction, a heroin addiction. And I have to say, I cried several times reading your most recent memoir, and especially the scene where you and Thomas, your son, have a
yes.
conversation. And it was an echo of the conversation that I had with Stephen. So talk about that from a father's point of view. I mean, we're gonna cover a lot of ground here, but talk about, you've been through the mill, you've clawed your way back, and then all of a sudden one of your kids comes to you and says, Dad, I need help. What
Yeah.
was that like?
Well, incredibly, John. And I'm sad for your loss. And I wish I had known your son. I wish I'd been in a position perhaps to influence his journey. But
Mm,
there is a terrible epidemic of opioids in this country. It continues today. It shouldn't be happening
right.
because we as a society should be able to get on top of this. And we can talk more about that later. But father to father, I can understand what it's like to lose a child. I've been blessed that I didn't lose any of my children. And candidly, all three of my children have come to me and asked for help with a substance use issue over the years. It's very empowering to me that my children took my advice, which as I raised them growing up, I always said to them, kids, if you're at a high risk because your mother and me are both recovering people. And so your genetic predisposition is such that you could end up like we did if you choose to use. And they all chose to use. But I gave them that extra tool in the toolbox, which is it's okay to ask for help. Come
Yeah.
to me and ask for help. And Thomas and Henry and my daughter Nancy have all come to me during their own journeys and said, Dad, I need help. And all three of them have found the help that they need and are on their own roads of recovery, quote unquote. They do it differently than I do, and I have to respect that. But I'd like to think that my own example, as flawed and as imperfect as I have been over the decades, my own example has empowered them to do what I should have done at an earlier age, which is ask for help.
Yeah, yeah. Because when, I found out Stephen was using heroin when he had an emergency room episode, and the nurses basically said, "We are very worried about your son, but we can't tell you why." And so I went to him. And I mean, he was in the he was in the ER, and he was, they were waiting for tests and stuff. And I said, dude, I can't help you if you don't tell me what's going on.
Yeah, yeah.
And he said, well, let me think about it. Well, when he was discharged, he handed me his discharge paper with the doctor there, and it said, stop using heroin.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so we had a heart to heart that went about for an hour and a half, I think. I did not blow up on him. I didn't kick him out of the house. In fact, I told him about your book, Broken,
Ah,
the first memoir, and I told him about you. But for some reason, um, I kick. Guilt is a big part of this, and I kick myself for not putting him in touch with you or Hazelden. But he and I, as we talked, he indicated that he was depressed, and so we were going to deal with the root problem.
yes, yes.
And so he was trying to make an appointment with a psychologist, and they said the schedule's full, call back in 2 weeks, and he was dead a week later. So I never experienced the I'm sure agony that your parents went through when you went off the grid. And of course, that was in and out of rehab for you for several times.
Yes.
So I don't know. I mean, did I handle it right? I mean, is there advice you can give to parents on how to help their kid deal with this when there's such a feeling of helplessness?
Well,
Take take
hindsight's
take
always
your
what it
time.
is.
Take your
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
hindsight, John, is always what it is. And when the result is something as tragic and as filled with grief as your experience has been, you can ponder those things forever and never get the answer that you want because it won't change anything. That said, I think it's important that parents always keep that lifeline open to their children, that communication. And a lot of parents say, I'm going to take away their cell phone or I'm going to not pay their bill anymore. I always say to parents, let them keep their cell phones and keep paying their bill, because oftentimes that connection, literal connection, is the only avenue to trying to change things. So I think your example, your story, really, for me, reflects the power of the importance of a family recovering, even when the outcome is what your outcome was. You lost your dear son, but here you are, John, able to talk about it, able to share it. To me, that's the inspiration that too many families don't have, which is the fact that despite all these terrible things that have happened, you, John, have recovered, and you are continuing to walk your own walk. And I tell parents all the time who have lost a child, a loved one, to this illness, that no matter what happens to your loved one, you yourself have to recover. And people look at me like, well, why would I need to do that? And I'm saying, because addiction ravages much more than just the person who has it. It ravages the entire family. So I think you're leading by example. And while you might want to look back and take a second chance or ponder if things could have been different, the reality is what the reality is. And the truth is that you are recovering and you are continuing your journey, and you're honoring your son's life and his legacy by sharing the way you are.
Woof. Thank you. That's very encouraging. Let's talk. Let's talk. Let's go to the videotape. No,
Yeah.
let's talk about your the memoir that's out now.
Mhm.
And let me get this out of the way. This is the most recent one, and it's very powerful. I gave it a 5-star review on Amazon.
Thank you.
It's Broken Open, which obviously is a follow-up to Broken, the first
Yes.
memoir. What Painkillers Taught Me About Life and Recovery. This talks about opioids. And so my question is, what did life teach you about life and recovery?
Well, that's fodder for an entire podcast. So here we
Right.
go. John, my story is one in which I was caught in the grip of addiction early on as a teenager in the late 70s and the early 80s. I had a lot of consequences, even though I continued to function as a newspaper reporter in Dallas and then in New York, and then later, of course, at CNN with you. I started my journey in recovery in 1989. When I came out of a crack house in Harlem, New York. I could no longer hide the reality that I was addicted to crack cocaine and alcohol and other things. I began my journey in recovery. I had 4 treatments over 5 years between 1989 and 1994, as you referenced. I found sustainable recovery in 1994 at a treatment center called Ridgeview outside of Atlanta. When you and I were working together at CNN. And for the next, 15 years or so, I lived what I call a V-shaped recovery. I had gone down, I had hit my bottom, and I had gone back up, right? As we all want to do. That's what we aspire to do, to bounce off that bottom and get better. And my first book, Broken, a memoir that came out in 11 years after that had happened, it was a V-shaped recovery. It was a book that I had to live up to, a story I had to live up to. It's a true story, but it's a memoir frozen in time. It's 19 years old, and a lot of things happened to me right around the time that Broken came out, and in the years subsequent. Some of them happened to me while I was sober, such as my own shortcomings as a husband, my own moral failings. I had a very difficult divorce. Not that any divorce is ever easy. That I had to experience as a sober man, and that was very painful. To have a broken heart, heartache. I know what it is because I felt it.
Because you weren't anesthetizing the pain.
No, I was feeling it like most humans do. Addicts and alcoholics like me, we like the heighten the highs that mitigate the lows. But here I was going through that time. I became a single dad to 3 busy children. I had a full-time job working at Hazelden Betty Ford, and so on and so on. the story of Broken began to fall apart right about the time it was published in 2006 and then in paperback in 2007. In 2012, I had dental surgery, and that dental surgery led to a neuralgia in my jaw, and that neuralgia in my jaw led me to pain medication that I could not get off of my own free will.
Mm-hmm.
I could not get off of those pain meds with my program of recovery, which for me was the 12 steps. I could not get off of those pain meds, even though I was a public advocate for Hazelden Betty Ford. I could not get off of those pain meds, even leaning on my faith in a higher power. I was struggling for 3 years, even though I looked good on the outside and continued to function, ironically. On the inside, I was struggling like I had struggled in the past. This was different, though, because I did function. I did show up. And suddenly I discovered why we have an opioid epidemic in this country. Because, they say a drug is a drug is a drug, but that's not true. Opiates are a bear unto themselves, a beast unto themselves. And those opiates get into the brain and they cause a craving for the substance that is like, well, I couldn't get relief for it anywhere else. So for 3 years, John, I struggled with pain meds. What I discovered out of that experience is that there is no such thing as a V-shaped recovery, number one, because stuff happens along the way. Number two, all those things that had been so important to me in terms of those tools, they weren't enough this time. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, I learned that for me, there is more to my recovery than sobriety. That's not to say that sobriety isn't a good thing. It's a necessary state of being for a lot of us, but it is possible to recover even when we are struggling with sobriety. And I think that's a really important message for your
What do you
audience.
mean? What do you mean that it's more than sobriety?
Because sobriety is a good thing, and it's a natural. It's not a natural state. Most humans are not sober. They drink coffee, they smoke cigarettes, they have a glass of red wine, they might smoke a little bit of marijuana, take some THC. Human beings have always been pursuing oblivion in one way, shape, or form. But sobriety, if you are dependent on substances like I am, you have to be sober from those substances if you want to expect a good outcome. But what I have learned in my struggle with pain pills a decade ago, John, was that I could struggle in my sobriety. I was not sober, but I could still hold on to the hope that for me was my recovery. That was really critical. In other words, I was seeing the North Star. There it was. I was following that North Star, and it was a constant, but there was potholes and trenches and flooding rivers and, rocks and crevices to get over. It was a hard time following that star, but I still had my eye on that star is my point. And that was eye-opening for me because I had always assumed that sobriety was the end all.
One of the things I really liked about your Broken Open, the most recent memoir, is the you quote from your journals
Yes.
about the way you were. I mean, the dental surgery that you went through was legit. The pain was legit. This was at a time before the opioid epidemic, before they realized opioids were a problem. It was considered to be a panacea.
Yes.
And yet there was that moment where you took them the way you were supposed to, +1.
Yes, John. Yes. I read from that all the time. On the book tour, every place I go, I read that +1 excerpt because
it leads to +2 and 3 and 4.
Yes. And there's a reason why the directions are on the side of the bottle and they say take 2 every 4 to 6 hours. It doesn't say take 3 every 2 hours or 4 every 6 hours. I mean, and that's the nature of addiction in the brain of somebody like me. We don't follow directions.
And that's why your journal entries are so interesting, because you understood what was going on and you were partly rationalizing,
Yes.
And partly realizing this is dangerous. And there was an inner struggle. You knew that this was dangerous. You knew that it was having, a very calming effect on you. And so for the longest time, you were rationalizing and hoping that you could get beyond it. So here's the thing that makes your memoir controversial
Hmm.
is that, up until this point, AA has been really big on, a higher power, and that
Yes.
higher power is not another drug.
Right.
And yet, the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thanks for setting me up, man. Listen, as I said, I've been in recovery for more than half of my life in one way, shape, or form. I've been in recovery, so I've had a lot of sort of practical experience. I've worked for Hazelden Betty Ford for 28 years, so I'm not a clinician, but I've been around that for a long time. Suddenly, the the resources in my toolbox were not working the way they'd always worked before. Well, and the irony of it is they continued to work when it came to crack cocaine and alcohol. I still haven't had a drink or that kind of drug in 30 years, October the 12th of 1994, when I came out of the crack house in Atlanta. So I had all those tools. I had a lifetime of experience. But man, this craving brain. I mean, there was actually an excerpt from one of my journal entries. And anybody who's thinking about writing a book should always keep a journal because it's
Oh,
just a good
absolutely.
thing
Or
to
going
do.
through grief or anything like
Yes,
that.
anything. It's just you capture it in real time. And when you look back at it later, you go, well,
Because you forget a lot of those
you
things.
forget a lot of the edges to it, the nuances of it. Yes, indeed. There's an excerpt from one of my journal entries in which I say, I know what not to do. I know what to do. I do both.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a real struggle. And
And
in the
so
end,
how did you get out of it?
I had to go back to my internist, Dr. Jim Giefer, who'd been my internist for 20 some odd years. He knew me. He knew I was a recovering person. I said, Jim, I can't do this anymore. And he said, well, William, I can't help you, but I want you to go see an addiction doc in Minneapolis by the name of Dr. David Frenz, Frenz. And I went to see Dr. Frenz because I needed to stop this. This was crazy. And he prescribed a medication, an FDA-approved medication called Suboxone or buprenorphine. It's an anti-craving medication designed very best what science and medicine can offer us. It's designed to quiet this craving brain, and I'll be darned if it didn't work. The first time I took the medication, suddenly the obsession of the mind, as they often talk about in addiction, the obsession of the mind was gone.
Now, do you still take that drug?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question because I was in Santa Monica at a bookstore called Diesel's just 2 days ago or 3 days ago, and somebody asked me that question. I get that question 2-3 times a week. It's usually a question asked by people in the recovery community. I give you credit for asking it because you're a journalist at heart. But my response is this, and then I'll answer the question. Why is that important to ask? And it's interesting to get the response. And so I would ask you, and then I'll tell you, why is it important that you ask me that question? But before you answer, I'll go ahead and tell you, yes, I do take the medication because why wouldn't I? It's like the diabetic who takes their insulin or the hypertensive who takes their Lipitor or the depressive who takes their Prozac.
Right.
It works. And
yeah,
so
the reason I asked the question, I mean, I did an interview back in the Army when I was at the American Forces Network. I did an interview with A.E. Wilder Smith, who was a pharmacologist and anti-addiction kind of person. And of course, the reason that he was being interviewed, or he was on tour, because the U.S. military had a major drug problem. And so they brought in this expert. And in the interview, he basically, because methadone was the, supposedly the cure for heroin addiction. And he said, well, actually, it's just replacing one drug with another. And he was an evangelical Christian, and he felt that, the spiritual solution was, the higher power was the solution. And I know it's still controversial within the recovery community.
Oh, it's not just in the recovery community. It was controversial, quote unquote. When I revealed my experience, it was controversial within my organization. There were people who questioned what's been going on with Moyers?
Were you at risk of losing your job?
No, because my employer understands these things. I mean, they struggled with it, but I've always been supported by my organization. My boss at the time, the CEO, Mark Mishik, he was perplexed by what I was revealing. Less so, I think, about the medication, and more so about the fact that for 3 years I've been struggling with pain meds, but showing up for work every day and raising millions of dollars for our mission and doing all the other things I was assigned to do.
Right.
But there was some bias in the organization, and there was a lot of bias, as there is today in the recovery community, about the use of an anti-craving medication, in part because it's got an opioid in it.
How long have you been taking this
Since
Suboxone?
2016.
Okay. And so I would then assume that, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you obviously it worked from pill one, but it still works. And it's not, there aren't the side effects or the dangers of it becoming a crutch.
Even if it was a crutch, I would argue that for a lot of recovering alcoholics, cigarettes are a crutch.
Yeah. Because I mean, AA meetings are noted for the
smoke,
and the coffee. That's sort of the new drugs. Right.
The co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, two of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, they both smoked themselves to death sober. And so I'm poised to sort of dive down into the rabbit hole of this issue nationally, because I think I'm going to have to do it once the book tour subsides. Mm-hmm. But because I work in the field, I think I'm going to have to take this on, because, I get a lot of
pushback,
criticism.
Pushback
is a better term. Thank you. Pushback from people who say, well, why do you still take that medication? Or why did you take it in the first place? Why didn't you just go cold turkey or do it the way you did it with crack cocaine and alcohol? I understand where that comes from, but the reality is I don't see really any difference. If you want to call Suboxone or an anti-craving medication a crutch, then so are cigarettes. And yet we tolerate the use of cigarettes. In fact, at Hazelden Betty Ford, we don't sell tobacco products anymore, but we still allow our adult patients to smoke cigarettes.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's no shame in using crutches, I suppose you could say.
Listen, it beats the alternative, which is to fall down and maybe die.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I will tell you, I'm on my way down to Atlanta next week to give a speech at the Atlanta History Center. And I'm going to use that as an opportunity to point out that, particularly at treatment centers and in the recovery community in the South, there is a strong bias against the use of such medications, to the detriment of the patients who are being treated for an opioid use disorder.
Okay. We know that addiction is a disease. My question is it genetic? Do you think? I mean, are there some people who become addicted because of life circumstances, and by taking substances, it changes their brain chemistry, and so that also can fuel addiction?
It's debatable.
Go ahead.
You're going to get, if you ask 20 people, is addiction a disease? You probably get half that will say it is, and the other half will say it isn't. And of the half who say it is, there'll probably be 8 or 9 different definitions of what that means. Here's what I say. Addiction is an illness. I don't use the term disease anymore, because I think there's some members of the public who just can't get their head around the idea that addiction is a disease. But there's no doubt it's an illness. It affects the mind, the body, and the spirit.
Yeah.
So it is an illness. Trauma. And many people, many of our patients at Hazelden Betty Ford, most of our patients can have had a traumatic experience somewhere in their life, maybe as an infant, maybe as an adult, whatever it is. And trauma can feed addiction. There is a genetic predisposition, as I know in my own family. There are many factors, internal and external, that ultimately lead about 10 to 15 to 20% of the population to develop a baffling inability to just say no to substances.
Let's presume that there is certainly a genetic component to that. And if there is a genetic component, then some people would argue, well, then, you've basically just taken yourself off the hook and you're no longer responsible for your own actions. But on the other hand, there's plenty of evidence, you included, of people who may have this genetic predisposition, and yet they still are able, for one reason or another, to be able to put that behind them. So my question is, if it's genetic, what is it that allows people or enables people to get over the addiction and move on with their lives?
Addiction is not an excuse. It is an explanation as to why good people do bad things. Rational people act irrationally. Loving people hurt people that they love. And moral people act immorally. I willfully ingested substances into my body when I was a teenager that turned on a light switch in my brain, which I could not turn off of my own free will. That does not excuse what I did under the influence, but it helps, again, to explain it. So I don't buy the argument that addiction lets people off the hook. No. But I do embrace fully the fact that for some of us who willfully ingest substances, the difference between me and you, for example, is that you can have a beer after a baseball game and I can't. Yeah. Or you can maybe eat a THC gummy and I'm playing with fire if I do. Or you can follow the directions on the side of the bottle and I can't. Whatever it is an illness. It is an illness that too many people die from. And it's an illness in which people don't get access to care. I got that access, not once, twice, not three times, 4 times I needed treatment to pick up those tools and learn how to manage my chronic disease. And then when I had a recurrence of use with the pain pills, I still got access to care. I got the best addiction doc in the Twin Cities. My insurance covered it, etc. So the reason why a lot of people or most people don't recover from addiction is because they either have a special virulent strain of it, just like people who have a strain of cancer, or they don't get access to care or don't get access to care again. That's, to me, the big difference. Again, it doesn't excuse what we do. As I speak in jails and prisons a lot, and I say, you do the crime, you do the time. Stone cold sober or stoned out of your mind. But if we just lock people up in this country under the assumption that punishing them is going to cure them, well, no wonder we have a war on drugs that's failed in this country.
Are you finding yourself on Capitol Hill trying to, get legislation passed and get more access to mental health treatments and things like that?
Yes, not so much anymore, John, because in Broken, I talked about the importance of getting insurance companies to cover addiction. Well, that was in 2006. 2 years later, in 2008, we did get that legislation passed the Congress, bipartisan approach, and we had President Bush sign that into law in October of 2008. And then 2 years later, we got addiction and mental illness covered under the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. So today, 95% of the patients at Hazelden Betty Ford use their insurance to access our system of care. As it should be.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the whole higher power thing, because there is a spiritual component here. And I've never been involved with AA or any of the 12 steps, but what I understand based on my friends, it's sort of like, you're higher. It's sort of like God in terms of however you define. I mean, how do you approach the whole higher power thing?
Well, I've been very fortunate because, as you know, my father, the journalist Bill Moyers, before he was a journalist, before he served in the Johnson administration and the Kennedy administration, my father was an ordained Southern Baptist minister. When I was born in 1959, he was in seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, and he and my mother pastored a small church. So I was raised with that pretty good understanding of a power greater than myself. In this case, I call it God.
Let me stop you for just a
Please.
second, because there's a great anecdote in, I think it's Broken, where your dad is LBJ's press secretary. It's right after the Kennedy assassination. It's Thanksgiving. Your dad is saying grace. Pick up the story from there.
And the president at the end of the table says, "Speak louder, Bill. I can't hear you." And my father, without batting an eye, without missing a beat, says, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, but I'm not talking to you," or something like that.
Right.
So I always had I've never struggled with my belief in God. Where I struggled was in trusting. There's a big difference between believing and trusting. And for me, I had to trust that God could do for me what I could not do for myself. And in this instance, it was about like getting better, overcoming my addiction. And so I think, in 12-step recovery, and there are many pathways, by the way. The other thing I've learned along the way is there's many pathways to recovery. The 12 steps is a good one for a certain subset of people, but it's not the only one. But in the 12 steps, there is an emphasis on God, not in a religious kind of way. People say that AA is a cult or a religion. It isn't. It isn't. It just suggests that you believe in something greater than yourself, whether it's God or this book or the group, which is oftentimes how people find that higher power in the group experience.
Uh-huh.
And that's, I think, really, really important. I think it's important for all of us to have a fundamental belief or trust in something, because we got to go through life. And life, as you know, John, is hard. And why do we want to do that by ourselves? Let's lean on something. And if we can lean on our faith, then it's going to be a little easier to get through.
Well, then that really leads me to, I want to bring in this book.
Yes.
I read the introduction. It's on Amazon. It came out, I think, did it come out after Broken?
Yes, after
Okay.
Broken.
And it's basically, now what? Now that you've, admitted that you're addicted, now what? And so talk about this book a little bit.
Well, I thank you for bringing that book up. That book kind of got stuck in between Broken, which was a New York Times bestseller and remains in print, and my new one, which is doing pretty well and getting a lot of attention, a lot of visibility. But this book is really a primer on how to get from the problem to the solution. Now, the irony of it, if there's an irony in it, John, is I wrote that book in 2011 before I had my experience with pain meds. And before I began to evolve even my perspective or understanding of these things. Like I said earlier, there's more to my recovery than sobriety. I'm not sure I could have written that back when this book was written. But this book really helps people to move from the problem to the solution, with an emphasis on the solution being treatment and 12-step recovery. I'm proud of that book because, first, my parents, Judith and Bill Moyers, who, believe it or not, are still living. My dad's 90, my mother's 89. They wrote the foreword to it because, as parents, they were affected and they had that question in their minds. Now, what are we going to do with our oldest son? And so they wrote that foreword. I'm proud of that book. Jane Brody gave it a great review in the New York Times back then. And the reason why I also wrote that book, John, is there's such a shame and the stigma around this illness that people don't talk about it. And that shame and stigma can cause people not to ask for help or not to seek an answer to their question, now what? We don't have that same shame and stigma with breast cancer or diabetes or even depression anymore. But we still have it for the most part with substance use disorder, as we now call it. So that book really is to sort of help steer people towards an answer to the question, now what am I going to do? And I think it's helped a lot of people.
I want to just read quickly from the foreword that your dad writes, "Our son says he dedicated his first book, Broken, to his parents because we were with him, quote, every step of the way."
Yes.
Ha! He says, ha! He was too drunk and drugged to see how many times his father in particular stumbled. It seemed to me that every other time I put my foot down, I stumbled or fell into quicksand.
Well, my father and my mother I know they struggled. They, as we pointed out earlier, they were as affected by my illness as I was affected by my illness, which is why it's so important that parents and families recover no matter what happens to their loved one. But I never, ever had a sense that my parents weren't with me every step of the way. I know they had their moments, but the point of it is I know they were with me and they
Sure.
supported me. They hated my illness. They hated what I did under the influence, but they continued to love me. And I really believe that their love and their support is one of the critical elements of of my journey.
Yeah, I can remember, as I mentioned, I don't know if I've mentioned on this program yet. I mean, I'm working on a memoir myself,
Mm.
and there was a moment when I was using some, marijuana, and I was not a nice person. And my mom said to me, and this I still remember, she said, "John, I love you, but I don't like you."
Yeah, that's very appropriate. And I think that's why families have to go, like we said, go through their own recovery process. My parents have been unflagging over the, I mean, I'm 65 years old. I've never doubted for a moment they weren't with me every day of my entire life, even though we had some pretty rocky time.
Because you're the firstborn, right?
I'm a firstborn, and I
There's a lot
struggle
of
with,
pressure. There's a lot of pressure on the firstborn just because they're first.
well, they're first, and one of my defects of character is my perfectionism, and I even now, I mean, I've been walking this walk in one way, shape, or form since I was 30 years old. Now I'm 65, so it's been a long time, but I still struggle with those things that have nothing to do with my use of substances, but have everything to do with my ability to live life without using those substances.
Yeah.
That's why recovery is, for me, not a destination, it's a journey. And this journey, as difficult as it's been, as many highs as I've had and as many lows as I've had, it has defined the last 35 years of my life, and I'm grateful for it.
Have you ever given some thought to what your life would have been like had you not been addicted?
Yes, John, it's why I live with a sense of wonderment. People think they, they want, sometimes wonder if I'm rational, or they say I'm too giddy with joy and everything. Every day of my life is a gift.
Yeah.
Every day is a gift. And that gift is as a result of not just my addiction, but my ability to overcome it. I am a prime example of the fact that from adversity comes opportunity.
Mhm.
I've had a lot of adversity with my substance use issues, but I have had a lot of opportunity because of the people that I've met along the way. And the fact that you and I are having this conversation 30 years after we were last in a room together at CNN, that's just another affirmation of this journey that I'm on. So yeah, man, I went to treatment in 1989 at Hazelden when I was 30 years old, thinking that it was going to help me understand how to either drink or drug differently, or at least stop having those problems. I had no idea that for me to recover would require me to change massive elements of my life.
Right.
And what a gift that I've been able to do that. And then the fact I got a job at Hazelden, and the fact that I've written these books, and the fact that I get to be on a podcast with you. I mean,
Oh, well, this is the highlight of your life here, man.
I'm lucky. And by the way, I always say I'm lucky. I know there's more to it than luck, but I'm not sure that I'm blessed because, if God was picking blessings to bestow on various people, why did he pick me and,
Yeah. Yeah.
not pick your son, for example?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Because,
Yeah.
I live in this space where I deal with people every day who struggle with substances, and many of them don't make it. And I don't think they don't make it because they don't believe or because they're unlucky. I don't know what it is, but the fact that I have made it in some cases despite me means that the greatest thing I can do in this life is to give back what I've been given.
Yeah, I mean, I also think about the roads not taken. I mean, I was going to go into politics. My dad was a lawyer, so we
Yeah,
were going to go into practice together. You went into journalism because your dad was a journalist,
yeah.
and I, I'm not going to go into the whole story, but I mean, for the good of the country, I decided to go into journalism and
Mhm,
not politics. I mean, I was going to run for president, really,
mhm,
and
mhm.
And yet the kind of person I would have been, I think back then, had I not had the experiences that I had, faced the things that I did, had the spiritual resources that I
Yes.
had, I'm a different person and a better person than I probably would have been as a politician and a lawyer.
You know, my dad says to me when I turned 60 years old, this was 5 years ago, it was right before the pandemic. He said, son, I'm really proud of you. You've saved more lives in 60 years, he said, than I've saved in 85.
Oh my goodness.
And I thought, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What a nice affirmation that is. And I always struggled in the shadow of my father's fame and his achievements, well-earned achievements, and I've struggled in the shadow of my mother's successes and her expectations of me, and so on and so forth. I've always struggled with a sense of self-worth that I think speaks to the core of probably why I use substances from the emotional aspect. I also use them because I got a vulnerable brain and I can't stop. But I feel like I have contributed to society. I have made a difference. And that is the gift that we all want to receive as we walk this journey, that we have made some difference in some small corner of this massive universe.
You have been on a book tour. I mean, it's still going on. This is sort of a respite in between, but you talk to a lot of people and a lot of people who are desperate.
Yes.
And that's got to be draining because that's a lot of pressure. I mean, in What Now, I think you use, there was a message that you got from a guy who had a gun in his mouth and he said, I'm going to kill myself if you don't help me.
Yes.
I mean, that's pressure. How do you deal with that?
Well, there wasn't that. I've always felt like I dealt with it pretty well, but clearly looking back on it now, in that run up to my experience with the pain meds, I probably was giving away too much of myself and not keeping enough for me.
Yeah.
And I think we all have to worry. We all have to be cognizant of that. So I like to think I've dealt with it pretty well, but it is taxing. I mean, I know why people who are in a helping profession oftentimes end up needing help, because whether you're a pastor or a doctor,
they have to take care of themselves.
And I've been good at that sometimes, and I haven't been so good at that at other times. And I think one of the revelations, if you will, that I had under the pain meds is that I suddenly, when I was taking those meds legitimately prescribed for this neuralgia, when I was taking them, it was helping the pain, but it also sort of just let me off the hook.
Yeah, that's
right. And so life was a little bit more tolerable. The sharp edge that I ran along was suddenly a little duller, and that was a good thing. So I'm not sure I've always dealt with it the good way. However, I will say this. I know we're running out of time here, but I don't wake up in the morning and I don't go to bed at night without thanking God for the gift of another day. Yeah. And the gift of another day for me encompasses a lot of things, but one of the gifts that it encompasses is the ability to help other people, or to give a piece of myself. That giving myself to others is good for me.
Yeah.
As long as I'm balanced. And
there it is, the balance.
What a gift. But I've had my moments, and this book tour has been hard. And I am 65 years old, and I don't have a lot of time left to work.
Well,
I don't want to work like that.
Well, you're well preserved, sir. And
I'm trying, but you know what? It's funny. I think one of the reasons why I may be a little bit more preserved is because I don't drink and take drugs. And there's nothing wrong with drinking and taking drugs if that's what you want to do. And there's a lot of people that can do it, quote, responsibly. But I don't think I think I'm a little bit well preserved because I'm not pickled.
When I turned 60, that was a moment, because that everybody I knew who was 60 was old.
Yes.
And so I'm 74 now, 74 and a half. And I'm the way I'm approaching it is I'm living as if I've got another 30 years.
Really?
I know I mean, you can't assume it, but look, Jimmy Carter just turned 100.
Yeah, yeah,
And, as long as I've got my mind and my health and, I'm able to, help people
yeah.
write books and stuff, then life is meaningful, which brings me to my, one of my penultimate questions is
Mm,
what's next? You mentioned that you're going to be dealing more with the whole issue of, a drug to help drug addiction. But
mhm.
I'm wondering, Cope, if, writing a novel might be something that is in your future.
Well, if so, you're going to have to be my writing coach.
It's a deal. It's a deal,
Okay,
man.
so there you go, because I know you pulled that off, and I know you're good at it. I might do that. I think I've got a little bit of time left at Hazelden Betty Ford. Here we are, in towards the tail end of 2024. I've been there for 28 years. The book is out. I hope it'll have a little bit of a run and give me some support over the next year or so. But I think I'll step back from the day-to-day grind, even though it's not always a grind. I'd love to keep writing. I mean, writing is a labor of love, with the labor always coming before the love. But the love of writing, the gift of
That's
the
right.
written word, is a beautiful thing, whether it's a novel or whether it's a memoir or something else. I don't know what I'll do, John, but I'm looking forward to stepping back from having to prove myself every day.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you really would like to address?
Well, listen, you're the ultimate interviewer. I can see that now. I always knew you to be such a sort of spot on journalist. You would take my copy at CNN and you would make it better, or you'd make it right, or whatever. But here you are, all these decades later, and you've asked me all these really good questions that nobody else has asked me, for one thing.
Whoa.
So I think you've covered it. I think if there was one other thing that I would like just to emphasize briefly, it's because I know there are going to be people who attend this webinar or this podcast, and they're going to be struggling.
Yeah.
And so my message to them would be, it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah.
We don't do that enough in society anyway. We define people asking for help as being weak or needy or whatever. That's BS.
Mhm.
But when it comes to substances and when it comes to mental illness, you don't need to struggle by yourself. You're not alone. It's okay to ask for help. Help is out there. And recovery, whatever your recovery is from and whatever it looks like, recovery is possible and it's worth the hard work. So if anyone out there is struggling, and your question to me is, what should they do, Moyers? I would say it's okay to ask for help. And I'm always available to help you.
I've got your email up there. It's WMoyers, Moyers, at hazeldenbettyford.org. And that's
Bingo.
HAZELDEN, bettyford.org. Also, there's a website, which is www.hazeldenbettyford.org. Very clever there. And there's also the hotline,
Yeah.
which is 1-800-257-7810. So there are a lot of avenues that that people can go. This has been a treat. I call you Cope because that's what we called you at
That's
CNN.
my middle name. Yeah.
That's your middle name. And although in Broken, you talk about how you really hated it
Yeah.
because, the kids would tease and all that kind of stuff. So now you're William. I will do my best
It's
to
okay, John.
get with the program.
That's fine. And that's the other thing is I have become more of a whole person. As flawed as I am, I've become more of a whole person through this experience of being an alcoholic and an addict. And remember, as I said earlier, I used to think that was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. And now I've discovered it's the best thing that ever happened to me because I overcame it, because I recovered from it. And from adversity, as I said earlier, has come this opportunity. And I just want to let people know that I'm here to help if that is what you or a family member need. I'm easy to find, and I'll help you.
Excellent. I'm John DeDakis. You've been one-to-one with me, and I've been one-to-one with William Cope Moyers. This has been wonderful. Stay on for just a second when we stop, so we can say goodbye. But Cope, this has been wonderful. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, John, so much. What an honor.